다들
Thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. Thank you. And now we will begin session 2. As introduced, the topic in session 2 is trends in the global 새마을운동. Now there will be 3 presentations followed by 3 discussions. Now then, allow me to introduce the speakers one by one. The first speaker is from France, from the Sarli Grands Écoles. It is Professor Sébastien Bertrand. And he will be followed by one from the Sri Lanka Media Center for National Development, Dr. Melinda Rajapaksha. And the third presenter is from the Nanjing Administration Institute, Professor Fei Jie Mo. And allow me to also introduce the panelists. First, Professor Hong Yu of Yeongnam University. And from the Korea Institute of Public Administration, Dr. Kwang-hee Lee, who is a senior research fellow. And from Kyungwon University, Professor Eunju No. Now each presenter would have at most 20 minutes maximum. And the 3 presentations, so after the 3 presentations are over, then we will listen from the discussants for up to 5-6 minutes per discussant. Alright, now then with that, let me invite the first speaker, Professor Bertrand. Could you come forward, please?
베르트랑 교수님은
Professor Bertrand will take a look at the French perspective on 새마을운동 in his presentation. Your presentation, please.
안녕하세요. 한국말.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I will not be able to speak in Korean.
English. I'm really sorry I can't speak Korean. I have been asked to give a French perspective on the 새마을운동. Actually, it would be an historical perspective on the 새마을운동, so I'm professor for history. And I'm sorry for those who already listened to my lecture in July at the Yeongnam University, because I have been asked to do quite a similar lecture this time. And I will talk actually about the relation between the 새마을운동 and France, which could be called as an untold story. An untold story because for French people, South Korea has always been seen as an industrialized country, a newly industrialized country, and not an agricultural country, and not a country where there has been a green revolution. So this could be considered as really unfair when we see what the result of the Sémaul movement in South Korea. So my purpose is not to forget that in the 60s, 80% of the population in South Korea was living in the countryside. So South Korea was at the beginning, at the origin of the South economic miracle in the 60s, a land of farmers, a land of peasants. And that's why the Sémaul movement is so important. So I will try to answer to 2 questions. How can we understand the 새마을운동 from France? How can we talk about the 새마을운동 from France? And how can we work on the 새마을운동 with French students? The 새마을운동 can be introduced in French lesson, in French lecture, as a part of a global strategy of developing countries in the 70s. It is a theme, it is a topic that is very frequently asked and dealt in French textbooks, in French lessons at the university, how the developing countries could develop themselves, what were the strategies of the developing countries in the 60s and in the 70s. In France, we consider that it was the era of the so-called Green Revolution in the Third World. The UNO established the 60s as a decade of the development, and the 70s were the continuing phase of this development of the 60s. But if we try to consider South Korea in French textbook about related to the Semaul movement, it has been more complicated because, as you can see on this map, which shows the diversity of the third world development models in the 70s, South Korea is not considered as a model of green revolution. So you can see here that South Korea is still considered as a new industrialized country, as such as the Republic of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So this is a problem that I have to deal with when I'm talking about the Semaul Undong, to try to explain that the development of South Korea was not only an industrial development, but also a development of the countryside. But if we look further, in a French history and geography textbook from the late 80s, and actually that was my textbook when I was at the secondary school, so we have here an entire chapter about modernization of culture rise. For French people in the 80s, we consider that the main problem in Asia, considering the huge population of this part of the world, was the modernization of agriculture and rice production. And we can see here a small article about the progress in the Republic of Korea devoted to the progress in agriculture. But the Semaul Undong is not mentioned. They only mention modernization, mechanization, and the increasing production of rice. So as you can see in French textbook yesterday and today, the Semaul movement has been for a long time neglected. The guideline of the Semaul Undong we can try to give to the French students are following. We had to start with the goal of the Semaul Undong. The main goal, President Park Chung-hee announced it in a conference, in a speech that he did in 1970 for provincial governors. From a local perspective, President Park Chung-hee said that the main goal was to make a country a good place to live in. And actually, President Park said that the situation of South Korea did not allow to be satisfied with theoretical discussion or to wait for a favorable situation, which means that this development of rural areas, of the countryside, was an emergency just after the first industrialization of the country. So President Park Chung-hee gave a concrete goal and gave also a method for the Semaul movement. The method is the so-called can-do approach, which means the great ambitions, and President Park Chung-hee was convinced that the South Korean people was a great people and need to be self-confident in his own success, in his perspective of success. And he gave the South Korean people an action code in 1972, which means that, as you know, the government gave the raw materials and explained the techniques to modernize rural areas, and after this, the population did the job by herself. But above than this, the meaning of community movement of Semaul Undong has been emphasized by President Park Chung-hee through a lot of symbols. The meaning of the big gathering, as you can see on the picture, the meaning of the flags, of the caps, of the jackets, of insignia that has been given to members of the Semaul movement is to give the South Korean people a sense of a unified country, of the same community, because, as you can see, the Semaul movement has been directed to rural communities, to villages. So it was important for President Park to show to the South Korean people that they all were part of a unique country, of a unified country. And actually, the leadership of President Park Chung-hee played a key role in the Semaul movement. This leadership has following parts. The first is that President Park Chung-hee wrote himself the song, the national hymn, I would say, of the Semaul movement in 1972 with a lot of mottos, and among those mottos, a quotation I already made, "Make our country a good place to live in." The second part of this leadership is the maybe 100 speeches, I couldn't count myself, the 100 speeches President Park Chung-hee gave for mayors, for students, for farmers, for provincial governors about the Semaul movement. President Park Chung-hee was a former teacher, as you may know, and he was absolutely convinced that a pedagogical approach of the Semaul Undong was needed if we want that the Semaul Undong could succeed. The third part is the visits, the mainly visit and inspection for peasants, for farmers that President Park Chung-hee did by himself. He wanted to be an example. President Park Chung-hee was a former peasant, a former poor farmer, and he was absolutely convinced that he had to show and to see from his own eyes concretely how the Semaul movement has been applied. And the fourth part is the promotion of the Semaul movement by the publication in foreign languages, among them English, of course. This book has been published in 1979, and it was actually it's a combination of 34 speeches of President Park Chung-hee about the Semaul movement, and it was made to establish a first billion, a first conclusion of the Semaul movement, with the main result in 1976, South Korea became self-sufficient in rice production. So that was the main result of the Semaul movement beyond the modernization of rural areas. So I come to the second point of my lecture, how it is possible to work on the Semaul Undong in France, because France and South Korea had very different destinies in agriculture and countryside. The first step, I'm sorry, it's not 3-1, but 2-1. The first step was the promotion of the Semaul Undong in France in the 70s. Actually, and I was surprised as I discovered this, but already in the 70s, the South Korean government made an enormous effort to promote the Semaul movement, to promote its development in France by the publishing of a book which is called Kore, Kore means South Korea, by the Ministry of Culture and Information in 1978, and another book written by President Park Chung-hee, Kore, la voix du renouveau de la nation, which means South Korea, the renewal of a nation. President Park Chung-hee said that this book was published in French because other French-speaking country could be beneficial of the South Korean experience. And among them, President Park Chung-hee developed foreign relation with African countries, among them Gabon, where President Bongo was at an official visit in 1975. So the promotional material of the Semaul movement existed, and as you can see here in the pages of this book, Kore, the Semaul movement has been described and nominating the key to success. Here they are talking about la clé du succès, the key to success, by showing big works. You see here the caps of the Semaul movement and a lot of realization and buildings and rice modernization production. And this book gives also a lot of statistics. For instance, the fact that 40,000 kilometers of roads were built by the peasants themselves, and that the growth in the average income of rural activities doubled between 1970 and 1975. But if we try to compare the situation between South Korea and France concerning the development of rural areas of countryside, it's very difficult to do, because at the same time, France was already a country where the population of the city has been much more than the population of rural area. As you can see, it was around 70% of urban population and 30% of rural population. And at the same time, the French agriculture was already a productivist model. This is here, a countryside in the south of Paris. The nickname is the wet reserve of Europe, plain of the Beauce. And here you can see a model of SkyTrain, which has never been used finally, but it shows actually the modernization of the rural areas in France in the 70s. But above all this, there is a way to compare the situation in France in the 70s and a way to take lesson from the Sémaol movement in the 70s and today for France. This book the title is La fin des paysans, The End of Peasants. And this book has been published in 1967. And the author, a sociologist, Henri Mandras, described the situation of the French peasants at the end of the 60s. And at that time, it was the end of a certain way of life, the way of life of rural area, the sense of rural community in France, because of the rural exodus, has been lost step by step. And in a way, the Sémaol movement was a proof that the sense of community was crucial, played a key role in the development of the campaigns, whereas in France, the productivist model has, as a consequence, the end of a certain way of life in France in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century. And a lot of people in France at that time regret this, the fact that this way of life disappears. When we come to practical exercise with my students, I would just mention two ways. The first, from the students of preparatory classes for high commercial school, is to show some quotation of President Park Chung-hee, some text here, you can see here on this document, that has been quoted from the books of President Park Chung-hee and speeches of President Park about the Sémaol movement. And here, this is other images from an American documentary taken from the series People's Century with testimonies about the Sémaol movement to give the French student a proof of how the South Korean people, the South Korean peasants, feel the improvement of their rural areas of the countrysides. With another class of my students, just smaller students, Chinese international sections, the students are 11 years old, I tried something else. I made a practical exercise about the Sémaol movement. So I showed them pictures from KTV about the Sémaol Undong and, here an inspection of President Park with the song of the Sémaol movement. Here are the lyrics of the song of the Sémaol movement. And thereafter, the students had to fulfill a table with the action of the peasants related to the words of the lyrics of the song and the result. Because for a Chinese international section, for students who are 11 years old, it's really important to be as concrete as possible. So by the relation between the action and the result, they can see actually what was the Sémaol movement and what was the final result of this movement. And if we go further, so the students actually, the small Chinese students actually, they made very interesting part and showed and understood, maybe much better than older students, what was the Sémaol movement with a short summary about the complete transformation of rural areas and the very fast modernization of villages. This is a summary the students did by themselves, so I helped them a little, and this shows that maybe for small students, for young students, the Semaul movement might be more understandable than for older students. I come now to my conclusion with a quotation of President Park. When we are talking about the socio-economic miracle, you know, President Park answered always, miracles are the result of action, effort, and the will of man determined to succeed at all costs, which means that President Park always said that miracles are the product of human action above all. If we look further to the conclusion of the French student, of my French students about this thing, I will just quote two of them. The first is a small Chinese student in international section, and she gave the final and I think the good sentence about this, the summary of the Semaul Undong. In South Korea, success is a collective adventure. En Corée du Sud, la réussite est collective, which means that from the example of the Semaul movement, she was able to give a global conclusion about the spirit, about the effort, and about the strategy of an entire people. And the second conclusion has been written by another student of mine, which is, who is this time a student in preparatory class for high commercial schools. And I think it's also a good summary of what was the Semaul movement and a good way to connect the concrete work of the Semaul movement and the spirit of the Semaul movement. In my opinion, Park Chung-hee represents a certain philosophy of life. For example, we have to create something out of nothing, and we are not allowed to slow down, our motto that represents a beautiful state of mind. Park made the Korean society to a disciplined, motivated, rigorous, and efficient population. Above all, the spirit of sacrifice is an admirable value that Park has instilled in the country. So, I just want to say, as a conclusion, as a personal word, that I was listening this morning the lecture of Professor Lee Sang-woo, Professor Kwon Young-min, and Professor So Jae-ho, and I think that all those professors demonstrated that the Semaul movement is not only a thing that must be fixed in the past, but also a movement of the present and of the future. And I do believe that by presenting and by explaining the history of the Semaul movement to French students, we can then build the future for a global and for a better world if we work together, French people and South Korean people, for improving this movement, its theory, and its practical exercise. 감사합니다.
예, 발표 대단히
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thus far, 새마을 운동 was usually viewed from the beneficiary countries, but now we have a perspective from France on the 새마을 운동. In particular, in order to do character building, teamwork, motivation, or diligence and making efforts to build that kind of attitude in the French students, we could see that 새마을 운동 can be used to motivate and inspire students. And it was very interesting to see. Thank you very much for your presentation.
발표자를 모시겠습니다. 스리랑카의
We will now move on to the second presentation to be delivered by Dr. Melinda Rajapaksha. If you could come forward, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sebastian was too tall, no? So I will start with a small introduction how I got interested in Semaul movement and the foundation, how this work came into highlight of my life. 3 years ago, we had the presidential election in Sri Lanka. So at that time, we were having a very lengthy conversation around what kind of development model Sri Lanka should take into consideration, how we should change the way we work on poverty alleviation strategy in Sri Lanka. And that conversation was driving into different directions. So the Singaporean development model is a very popular development model in Sri Lanka. So people were saying, why we don't become a country like Singapore? Why don't we become a country like Malaysia? Why don't we become a country like this, that? But at that point, we realized the best development model or the strategy we can apply to a country like Sri Lanka is available in Korea. So that is how we studied the Korean development model. And then I published it as a book, Poverty to Prosperity, a review on the development model of South Korea. So which was very well received in Sri Lanka. We created completely a new level of conversation around the development model and the development strategy in Sri Lanka. So in my presentation today, what I'm going to talk about is the poverty alleviation strategy of Sri Lanka. Not about what Semal Movement or Foundation is doing in Sri Lanka. That will be done by Choi during the next session. He will talk about what they are doing in Sri Lanka. So after both sessions, you can analyze how those two strategies complement each other. So this Janasavya, Samurdhi, Aswasuma, 3 names you can see on the top. Janasavya is the oldest poverty alleviation program in Sri Lanka, which was there from late 1970s, early 1980s. Samurdhi is the longest and the heaviest poverty alleviation program in Sri Lanka. Samurdhi means prosperity. That was from mid-90s to beginning of this year, and now it has converted into, you all know, Sri Lanka went through a massive economic crisis during the last 2 years. The country was, country announced basically the debt restructuring process and the bankruptcy. So new poverty alleviation program is called Aswasuma. So that's introduced with the support of the World Bank. That was introduced few months ago. So the very, since most of you might not aware of Sri Lanka much, this is a bit of introduction to Sri Lanka. We have 22 million people. It's a small place with 65,000 kilometers. But it is a diverse place. You have Sinhalese, Tamils coming from India, then the Muslim. We have been a colony for almost 150 years, so we have Burghers, Malays. Then we were a colony for 300 years. Portuguese, Dutch, then English were there for almost 150 years. So that we were basically a British colony for the longest time. And we have executive presidents in our country, and we have one of the oldest parliamentary system in South Asia. And we were introduced the universal franchise at the very early stage by British. So everyone in Sri Lanka got the voting power in the beginning of 1900. So we were a very old democracy. So our GDP is $73 billion, and we are in the medium level of the Gini index. And we are a member of the SAARC, that's the South Asia Cooperation. We are one of the oldest members of UN, G77, and our foreign policy has been always non-aligned. And we hosted the non-aligned movement at the very beginning in 1970s. And another interesting part, Sri Lanka went through so many social and political issues and violences. In 1971, we had the Marxist insurrection, which was a mass devastation in Sri Lanka. A lot of young people died. In 1983, we had the ethnic riot between Sinhalese and Tamils, which went up to 30 years long war. Only in 2009, we finished the war. After 30 years of fighting, killing almost 100,000 people. And 88 and 89, again the young people did a leftist insurrection. Almost 40,000 young people were died during that insurrection. And 2004, we were hit by the tsunami. Again, around 70,000 people affected. And so the 26 years of war killed almost 100,000 people. So it's a very devastating history we have as a country. And in the recent history, 2019, ISIS attacked Sri Lanka during the Easter Sunday. That really hit our, we were predominantly depend on the tourism. It's a fantastic place for tourists to visit. So our main income our dollar income was coming from tourism. So 2019, when everyone heard that ISIS attacked Sri Lanka, so no one wanted to come to Sri Lanka for next 3-4 years because it was it was red flagged. Then 2022, we had the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. And the same year, the president has to step down, and new president was elected by the parliament. So that is the situation, political situation in Sri Lanka that is important to understand in this whole exercise. So we have 9 provinces, 24 districts, then 256 divisional secretariat, and 14,000 villages. That is how our entire administration system runs. And in our economy, 59% of the economy is from the service sector. And the agriculture sector is so big in Sri Lanka, but it's contributing only 8.4. And I think after 1980s, private sector has developed a lot. In our economy today, 85% of the economy is managed by the private sector. Then, so brief history to poverty alleviation in Sri Lanka, how it was done. So 1940s to 60, we had the rice stamp. As you all know, we are also major rice eating country. And this was given as a subsidiary. This was a major subsidiary in Sri Lanka. Almost 70-80% of the people were receiving this subsidiary at that time. So this is a reduction of price for a kilo of rice you buy. So then 70 to 77, we went through a very leftist reforms following Russia. And there was a total import ban. And the country moved to 100% local production. So there was a coupon system introduced. There were a lot of queues for people to buy things. That was, in the history, it says that was a very bad period. Then 1707, we opened the economy. So first time we became a capital market-oriented country in 77. And then 1990s, with the World Bank support, the government of Sri Lanka launched the Janasavya program, which was the first poverty, the kind of subsidiary program which was properly formalized at that time. And the major drive to build houses for people, that is called Gammudava. Then late 90s, we introduced Samurdhi program, which is now, I will talk about Samurdhi program in next few slides. And until very recent economic crisis, Sri Lanka had a major fuel subsidy, electricity subsidy, and a fertilizer subsidy. That was a major burden in our economy, these 3 big subsidies. And in Sri Lanka, education system is completely free. We all studied 100% free. And the health system is also 100% free. So government was bearing a massive social welfare burden in the country. And so our rural development effort has been always a very community-based approach. The non-government organizations were available in Sri Lanka from very early 70s, and the government worked with them always. But the governance has changed always. Whenever the governments change, every 5 years or 10 years, then those governments change their policies, practices, and the way they look at the subsidies. And subsidies have become a major political promise. So the promises are heavier, so the burden became more and more heavier on the budget of Sri Lanka. Gammudava program, this is a very important program in Sri Lanka, which started in 1980s, because at that time, at least almost 40% of the people in this country didn't have a stable house to live. So that was the biggest drive at that time. And that was attached to infrastructure development and giving microfinance. So it was very much linked to the poverty eradication at that time. So this program was a very successful program which was implemented in almost every district. So the government went and built houses and the community around that, the school and the health clinic, you know, that everything was built around that. So then this was reduced towards the late 90s when the government changed. So this was done by one particular president called President Premadasa. Then Samurdhi program, which is the biggest program, I will talk about that because this is in the center of our poverty alleviation. So 1995, the President Chandrika Bandaranaike, who initiated this program. So far, more than 1.6 million families have received the subsidy, while the Samurdhi Bank has given support to more than 4 million people. And it's a very heavy program. So 24,000 employees working for the Samurdhi program. Those are paid government employees. Then you have 30,000 grassroots organizations and 33 regional organizations and 25 district committees, again formed by the Samurdhi movement. So this is, so you have the Samurdhi program, you have the Samurdhi administration, then you have a kind of movement built around the Samurdhi program. And then we have the community banking framework where almost 1,100 Samurdhi banks, and the banks form the Samurdhi society. There are 335 Samurdhi societies. So this is a heavy major program happening in 3 levels: administrative level, community level, and the banking level. Then the Samurdhi program is running on 8 pillars, major 8 pillars. One is social welfare and security. That is where they give you the subsidy. Then the livelihood enhancement program, very much linked to the banking. Then you have the business growth initiative where you give microfinance. Then the societal advancement program where you form the small, in Sinhala it called Samiti, that means small societies. And then the society work together as a movement. Then the housing improvement initiatives, to build your house or to improve your house, some of the bank is giving a loan. Then the community-based organization scheme, that means the Samurdhi beneficiaries can form a community-based organization which will later supported by the Samurdhi program and other programs. Then the microfinance scheme. And there is a major information technology initiative now targeting kids of Samurdhi beneficiaries. So actually poverty rate in 1995, it was around 28%. And around 2016, it was reduced to 4%. And by 2019, it was reduced to 3.2. But now due to the financial crisis, this has again gone up to around 7.8%, 8%. And then the Samurdhi program, the achievements. So 400,000 families have been elevated from poverty, more than 100,000 houses has been built, and more than 225,000 students have received scholarships only within last 3 years, and more than 500,000 social security benefit programs. And in Sri Lanka, the loan rate is very high. Even today, if you take a loan, it's around 14%. So 175 million worth loans were given for 4% interest rate, and so on. So all together, 12 million loans, which worth 439 billion Sri Lankan rupees, given by the Samurdhi Bank for people to start different small initiatives, small businesses. And if you look at very much in the rural level, the small work, like it has constructed more than 41,000 toilets. And it has given what to call the agricultural projects beneficiaries more than 90,000. And the farm project 33,000 more than. And there is a major, we are an island, we are a small island, so major fisheries community in Sri Lanka. So more than 6,000 fisheries projects around the country. Around 100,000 small-scale enterprises. And the last one, the 5,000 vocational training project, there is a major drive to improve the vocational training drive in Sri Lanka. And so now we are going through the emergency funding program right now because of the economic crisis. I took 4 major pillars for that. So almost 2 million families are now receiving 39,000 million rupees under the World Bank. So that is a major subsidiary drive by the World Bank to support the ongoing economic crisis. So under the Asian Development Bank, during the COVID, almost again 2 million to almost 3 million families received more than 44,000 million financial assistance. This is during the COVID. Yeah, so these are the major numbers, how at the moment, especially from the beginning of the COVID time, Sri Lanka has been going through. And so this is the new program, which is starting from this year. So the Samurdhi program will be little bit incorporated into this. There are a lot of pros and cons on this, and major debate around this program. So 800,000 families have been categorized as the poorest, poor families, and 400,000 families as the extreme poor category. So there are 3 major categories: mental empowerment, economic empowerment, and the social empowerment. And this drive has a major digital drive. So all the field work needs to be updated via mobile app by the officials. And the Samurdhi Bank will have a complete e-banking system. And the benefit you are receiving, your cash grant, or your previously it's called a stamp. So your cash grant now will receive as a bank transfer. You have to remove it from your ATM card. So that's how it works in the new program. This program is yet to be implemented. And there is a major debate around the pros and cons of this new poverty alleviation project in Sri Lanka. So, so I tried my best to stick into the time frame. So that's all about the a very brief history and a summary of the poverty alleviation program in Sri Lanka. And I invite you all, if you want a copy of my book, I have few copies, around 40, 50 copies of my book. You can come, and after the session, you can come and grab a book. It's about the how the poverty alleviation process and especially the Semal movement, how whole that thing worked in Korea from a very Sri Lankan perspective, very South Asian perspective. We have written the book in a easy way to understand for the, especially for the young politician in Sri Lanka who has been having a new conversation around the poverty alleviation strategy of Sri Lanka. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
예, 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So that was about the poverty eradication program in Sri Lanka, for example, the Samurdhi. And Aswesuma, thank you very much for the very clear explanation. So I'm sure that there are similarities with Semaurundong as well as differences. Thank you. And given the time next, I hope that we can also make comparison with Semaurundong. Thank you.
연사를
Let us go on to the third presentation of the session. We have Fiji Mao. Please come to the podium.
Thank you, Melinda, for saving 2 minutes for me. We have good cooperation. 안녕하세요, 모피제라고 합니다.
Good afternoon. I am Mufi Ji. During the morning, we talked about the importance of cooperation. And cooperation is very important for community development. Today, I would like to talk to you about the study of the diversity of rural communities in China. Well, I did prepare my presentation slides, and since we have many practitioners here today, I will not go into the theoretical aspect, but jump right into the case studies. So first, what is a community? What is important here is that community can be divided into two different types of communities. First, communities based on emotions, like your families, or there could be communities that tries to achieve the same goals. And so those are communities based on interests. And so based on this, let me talk about the change of rural community in China. 1949 is an important year in the history of China because just before 1949, local governments were not interested in community businesses, and the upper class in the communities managed the communities at that time. At that time, the practices, the traditions, family traditions were more important than laws in these local communities. And ever since 2000, China went through a period of accelerated urbanization, which made the villages hollow out, leaving only children and the elderly staying in the rural areas. That actually led to the issues of community, and the biggest challenge is people, because if you don't have people, there's nothing that can be done. At the seventh population consensus, you can see that we still see a flow of people going from rural areas to urban areas, and this is what I have researched. Just like Korea, we do see some people moving back to rural areas. Well, currently, urbanization rate is above 70% in Korea. In China, it's at 70%. But we do see some people going back to the rural areas. This chart was created through my research from 2021. While I need to continue to update this data, I visited a total of 26 villages. And these are the people who migrate to rural areas. So let me focus on number 4 and number 5. Number 4 are farmers. These are farmers who migrated to other villages. So these are people who migrate from remote areas to villages near cities because they believe that they can have a higher income through farming profitable crops. And the 5th is newcomers, and these are the similar concepts to Koreans who move from cities to the villages. So in China, there are people who move from the city to rural areas to start their business as entrepreneurs or to live in rural areas. Here you can see a chart from my paper written in April. So why are people moving back to the rural areas? Well, the one axis is based on interest and one axis is based on accumulation. So this shows that using this classical tool for community research, Well, from 2021, I used a framework from the National Institute for Public Administration, and so I was not able to have enough data to create a new tool, but thankfully we went through a series of in-depth interviews during my research, and we have found that in all local communities, there are people who participate in the communities, and there's always a leading party in these communities. And so the participating people will interact to create the final result of the community, and that leads to unique characteristics of communities. And so this is the framework for analysis that I created. And participants is also divided into villagers, the government, and the third party. And using this framework, I was able to classify rural communities in China into 5 different segments. And the parts that I have checked are the players that are participating in the local communities, and those charted in red are the leading parties of these types of communities. And so let me go into the different types of communities. First is the traditional type of rural communities. Pictures here show the Dong nationality village, and these buildings are called goru, and there are drums at the top of these buildings. So if there's a town hall meeting, the drum would be beat and people would gather under the building to have this meeting. So you can see that the rules of the community are engraved in stone, and these rules are used to rule this local community. And some of the rules are not suitable for the current situation because they have been engraved hundreds of years ago, and usually there's a traditional ruler named Kuan in these local communities, and they only contact the government when it is absolutely necessary when it comes to subsidies, land, and other related matters. Any other matters are then solved within the local community with their own rules and procedures. The second type of community that I would like to talk about are traditional plus alpha, because they are adding new elements to the traditional aspects of communities. In China, there is an agricultural university, and volunteers from this university went to a Hibian village, and they actually conducted a poverty eradication project by improving their living environment and also raising awareness within the local community. For example, from 2018, there are national projects to foster the local communities, and one method of doing that is to have economic development in local communities. And so in many villages throughout China, they have projects for tourism and also restaurants. So here you can see that this house was retrofitted, and on the second floor, they have come up with a rental home. Well, this space was actually for pigs, and so they actually moved the pigs to other places, and now they're able to use this space as a rental home. It was the same for this community as well. Volunteers went into the community to help boost economic prospects, but they actually need to create a framework for the local participation, and this framework is currently lacking. And so if the volunteers leave this community, will the local residents be able to sustain their development strategies? That is something that people are quite worried about, including the volunteers who are there. The third type of rural community is traditional rural community combined with party leadership. And so it's a new type of community. In China, I do believe that 80% of the rural communities belong to this type of rural community in China. Many of the villages are seeing aging in their population, and there's a hollow out effect. It's about 30 to 50 people who are of the elderly group living in this village, and they are old and they don't have a lot of assets and wealth, and so they're not really interested in community development. This village in the picture is called Waisha Village. There was a group of grandmothers who participated in dance, and so the government leveraged this dance group to organize something called Grandma Bridge, and it was a way of enabling the residents to participate in entrepreneurship programs. They were able to gather the residents together to improve the local economy and also the local environment. And they were able to have the participation of the local residents. There's a standardization and institutionalization of this participation so that the citizens can actually create their own solutions to their own problems. So this is a way to foster capability within the residents so that they can find their own solutions. Many communities belong to this type because since 2009 at the 9th General Assembly, they wanted to strengthen the governance of the party and also to lead the governance of the local villages even through the party. And so many people are putting efforts into creating this type of local communities to improve the local economy and the local environment, and also to boost the happiness of the local community residents. The fourth type is similar to the third type. A difference is that in the third type, they actually mobilize the local residents for the community. But the fourth type, this actually is when the government introduces a third party to provide technical training and also to provide coordination for local disputes so that the local citizens can then participate in income generation projects such as rental homes. Here you can see that this is Greek management. This is because grid management is what is being utilized by local governments in China. So if there is a village or a location, they would divide the area using a grid, and each box within the grid would be led by the grid leader. And so they would be able to have the power to solve their problems, and all of the leaders within the grid would then come together to report to the state. So here you can see that third parties are introduced in a very systematic way by the government to find solutions for the local villages. This is the fourth type of local community. This is my favorite type of local community. This is called self-supporting type. This type of rural community is an example from Hangzhou in village. This actually is one of the wealthiest areas in China, but this village was a very traditional rural community, but in 2014, a newcomer came to this area, and that newcomer settled down here. And because of that newcomer, more newcomers came to this village. At first, their relationship with the original members of the village was very difficult because there was a lot of controversy on the way of life and a lot of the traditions. But there was a turning point because the government had a review of all of the wild dogs, and the government came in and they took all of the dogs in the streets, but the members of this community actually wanted the dogs back, and so they came together at the table to gather opinions. And even now, every last Saturday of the month, they gather in the afternoon to share opinions and also to enhance their understanding of each other to create a better village for all. So here you can see that in this rural community, there are many artists who live there. They're the newcomers, and they actually help the grandmothers create artwork out of bamboo, and they even have exhibitions. There was only 1,000 people living there, but about 200 to 300 newcomers came, and they actually led an inflow of people that leads to exhibitions and also wealth within the local community. And the original residents, they actually left their businesses to the newcomers because the original residents, they were older, and the newcomers, they were younger and they were more worldly. And so the original residents, they believed that the newcomers could do their business better. And so they actually left their businesses up to the newcomers. And they actually created festivals. A lot of Chinese festivals have dragon dances. And here you can see that parts of the dragon was given to each family, and each family decorated their own piece of the dragon, and they put the dragon back together to participate in this dragon dance for the festival. That actually fosters a sense of community. And I mentioned that the role of the government is very important, but the role of the government here is very unique because the government has a non-interference attitude for the activities conducted by the residents for this type. Because the local communities, they have to take responsibility for the residents, but at the same time, they need to show that they are productive to the central government. But the local government here, they did not focus on reporting to the central government, but they focused on the local community, and they noticed that the local community did not want them to interfere. And so that is why they have a non-interference principle. So I did write these points for discussion, but I will hold these points until the discussion session. Thank you very much.
예, 모 교수님.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mo, for your presentation. In China, we see various types of local communities, as we can see in your presentation. That is the same for Korea as well. Not all local communities are the same. So through today's presentation by Dr. Mo, I do believe that we need to also classify our rural communities for specific development plans. Now let's go on to the discussion portion of our session. As soon as we rearrange the stage, we would like to invite our speakers and discussants to the stage.
자, 이제 발표자와
Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite the speakers and the panelists to please come up on stage.
예, 이제
Thank you. And now we are going to go into the discussion time. So now I would like to ask the discussant to provide your discussion one by one. So we will also have to go back to the speakers for their response, and we would also like to receive some questions from the floor. So I would like to ask the discussants to be brief. So I would like to give you 5 minutes each. Now then first, Professor Yi from Yeongnam University. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentations. So in each country, the status of the rural development and also comparison with the 새마을운동. So thank you very much. I listened with great interest. Now with regards to 새마을운동, then looking at the other countries' rural development programs, I would just like to highlight some of the differences between the Korean version and the other countries. So then, first of all, Professor Sebastian's presentation.
You talked about the Green Revolution, and you also showed us the rural areas of France that was well managed. And so we have to take a look at the social structure. So the 새마을운동 was led by the government with the investment of the private sector. This was because government budget was secured to a certain extent. So it was successful thanks to the budget that was secured on the side of the government. Many researchers point this out. In 1966, the Korea Tax Office was established, and for the financial independence of the government, the Korea Tax Office did their part, and it seems that 30 to 40% of the government budget was international aid. But with the 새마을운동 that spread around the world in 1974, we no longer see international aid in government budget. And so Sebastian talked about Green Revolution. 새마을운동 and the crops that leads to high productivity, in particular of rice. These are hybrid seeds that we introduced in 1972. And so through a political system called 새마을운동, we were able to actually introduce dual grain price systems. So this actually enabled the government to purchase the rice at a higher price compared to the market price. And so because of this dual price system, the farmers were able to earn a higher income. And villages that did well in these aspects received more support, and with this dual price system, the government was able to directly provide financial support to the farmers through the 새마을운동. And I believe that's a very important social structure. And if we take a look at the socio-economic changes, well, we heard from Dr. Mao about the migration between urban and rural areas. This was the same in Korea. During the first 5-year economic development plan, we started to see the industrialization of megacities, and these megacities actually needed more manpower, and so the manpower from the rural areas moved to the urban areas. When we first started the 새마을운동, at that time, 2.5 million farmers had moved to urban areas already, even before the 새마을운동. Well, other sessions will deal with 새마을운동, so there you will probably be aware of the dualization of urban and rural areas. And so in order to make sure that there is investment of socioeconomic assets in the rural areas as well, 새마을운동 was utilized to make sure that there is no hollow out effect in the rural areas. So the 새마을운동 was a buffer to excessively rapid urbanization. If we take a look at past reports on 새마을운동, it talks about 새마을운동 as a buffer in the excessive outflow of manpower from rural areas to the urban areas in order to make sure that there is a soft landing. And so the economic effect of the 새마을운동 is something that we need to take into consideration from the social structure perspective. Last but not least, the basic principles of 새마을운동 is that support goes to overachieving villages first. So there are economic incentives for achievement. That is the basic principle of the 새마을운동. So from the political perspective, it may look quite ironic, but despite so, I did talk about inclusive growth. So if the overachieving villages receive support first, at the same time, education and training is provided to the leaders of underachieving villages so that these leaders could actually learn from overachieving villages. So that training opportunity was quite unique. If we look at rural development strategies of other countries, then for underachieving villages, then they would actually be provided a universal subsidy for poverty eradication. But 새마을운동 is very unique in that direct financial support was not provided to underachieving villages, but rather opportunities were given to learn from overachieving villages. And so there was an educational approach to bridge the gap. So that's very interesting about 새마을운동. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your remarks.
이광
Thank you. And now moving on to Dr. Lee Kwang-hee. Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon. Allow me to provide my brief discussion. Now, in the 21st century, then in terms of the international development cooperation, then the rural development is being highlighted, and now we are seeking a new paradigm for rural development. Now, the OECD has also offered a 7-stage rural development, so for example, governance and also basic infrastructure, urban, rural connection, and so forth. So these are some of the important parts of the OECD development recommendation, and they also refer to 새마을운동 quite a lot for this as well. So we can see that the 새마을운동 is occupying a very important position in the global rural development movement. But then I would say that at least from the domestic perspective, perhaps there has been lack of dynamic approach to this movement. And now, given that context, I believe that having this SEMA International Forum is highly meaningful. Now then, Professor Bertrand talked about how to view 새마을운동 from the French perspective.
I thought that was quite a fresh perspective. And so Korea is known to be a successful emerging industrialized country, but 새마을운동 is a way to add the rural development perspective to that story. And in particular, live well is the motto of 새마을운동, and this simple slogan has been embedded in the local residents so that the local residents can participate in the 새마을운동. And those points are the points that I would like to emphasize. Concerning Sri Lanka,
Now, Mr. Rajapaksha talked about the Sri Lankan Samurdhi movement and the Semaarundong. And yes, I also agree with the differences between the two. But then now in terms of this Semaarundong, you also talked about how this was a, let's say, more of a government-led or top-down approach. And I would like to raise a question and comment regarding this. So yes, Semaarundong, yes, it is better known as a top-down approach movement, but then also at the same time, there have been quite a lot of dedication by the Semaarundong local leaders and also very active participation from the villagers as well. So there was also the combination of the bottoms-up approach as well. So I would say that this type of a combination of approaches, top-down and bottoms-up, so that is what made it all the more important and effective. And also in the case of Korea, we also have the traditional like rice agricultural practices and customs where we had self-help and mutual help practices. Of course, this was lost in many ways during the Japanese colonial period, but still we have had the tradition, and I believe that that was also quite helpful. So I was just wondering then, in the case of Sri Lanka, then were there any such traditional practices or customs that were left that also helped fuel the rural development movement in the modern era? Then also you talked about some of the political and economic instability, and do you believe that so I'm sure that they have had some negative impact on the rural development program as well. And of course, for that, the government's effort and also the international effort are also necessary to help overcome them. And I wonder what your outlook is regarding those fronts.
Concerning China, Dr. Mao talked about the different types of rural communities in China, which was very interesting. So if we take a look at the local communities, the traditional communities may disappear due to urbanization, but you have shown that different forms of communities will be created. And so what would be some of the similarities of the new types of local communities in China with Semaurundong? Well, I'm not knowledgeable about China, but I understand that there are clan-based local communities and other cooperative communities within rural communities of China. And so that type of community, and comparing that with the Semaurundong as well as the Semaurundong leaders, how would we be able to connect the similarities? I think that would be an important task at hand. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we would like to invite Dr. Noonju. Concerning all three countries, France, Sri Lanka, and China, I think all three countries have presented very interesting stories. In terms of France, it was quite amazing because you talked about how you incorporate Semaurundong as a part of history to students in France, and it could be combined with character building for the French students, and that was quite refreshing and shocking because in Korea, we don't have any instances where at schools we turn on Semaul song and think about what Semaul Undong has done for us. And so I think your story was very meaningful. Of course, France in the 70s and Korea in the 70s is very different. And so it's very difficult to compare the rural development of the two countries in the 70s. But what about now? Currently, what are the directions for rural development in France today? And in explaining that, could Semaul Undong be a connection? In the case of Sri Lanka, the Kamudawa program or the Samurudi program were mentioned. And in talking about Sri Lanka, you talked about how the Samurudi program was not as successful as the 새마을운동.
And also in the abstract, it also says that there have been quite a lot of issues as well. Now, given that case, then, now let's say in other countries like Indonesia, now I would say that it is a bit different from the 새마을운동 spirit, but then they also have the Trisakti spirit, which is for independence. And they also often make comparison with this to 새마을운동, and they also talk about like the spirit of sacrifice and cooperation, determination, perseverance. So the Indonesian Trisakti spirit is similar in that way. And then also in Rwanda, there's what's called the Umuganda Day. So this is once a month. I mean, it's not forced labor, but then now what they do is they get together and also engage in work, unpaid work for the development of the village. And that is also about engagement, participation, sense of responsibility. So I would say that there are these similar spirits in other countries as well. So then in this context, then the Samurdhi program in Sri Lanka, then perhaps maybe you can also explain it from that perspective. And even then, if the Samurdhi program, if your assessment is that this was less effective and it was also saddled with some issues, then what do you believe were some of the biggest challenges, or what were the reasons for such issues?
In the case of China, you talked about the different types of rural communities. For the self-sufficient villages, there is the minimization of government intervention that led to successful results. And I think this is completely different from the 새마을운동 of the 70s in Korea. And so, although it is completely different, because in the 70s there was direct government support, there was also incentives by the government support that was combined with the efforts of the local residents to lead to successful results. But completely different in the self-sufficient villages, the government intervention was minimized for a successful result. We have these two types of villages, but what are some of the links that we can find concerning the success of both types of rural villages in Korea and China? Thank you very much for your remarks. We are a little bit behind schedule, so we would now like to first receive questions from the floor before we go back to the speakers. We will open the floor for questions so that the speakers can answer the questions together. Are there any questions or comments from the floor? If so, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone.
없으시면은
If none, then let me now go back to the speakers to respond to the commentaries by the discussants. So I would like to then go back to each presenter to speak for at most 2 minutes. So then first to Professor Bertrand.
Yeah, thank you very much for your remarks and for your observation. This is actually really interesting for me to see some reactions, because I try, as you know, to let known the Sémaul movement to French students. And I want to answer to Professor No Enju about the comparison between the current situation of South Korea and France about the situation in rural areas and countryside. Actually, I think that would be very interesting, because I have the feeling that in the countryside in South Korea today, because of the Sémaul movement, there is still a very strong spirit of a sense of community, of a strong spirit of what does that mean to belong to a rural community. And when this morning, I think it was Professor told us that 2 million South Koreans were members of the 새마을운동 today. I think we can do this as an example to take lesson from the Sémaul movement, the actuality, the Sémaul movement currently in South Korea. maybe to refresh some kind of spiritual rural way of life in France that has disappeared, that is going to disappear because of our situation with the city and or the productivist model. And I think that would be also a demand of the students of the French population, because you know, we are living all in the world, global warming and changing, and we are taking a great importance to rural and agricultural problems also in France. So maybe we can be inspired by the South Korean example currently. And the second point that I would to emphasize is what also Professor No emphasized. It's the fact that the French students are indeed, and I noted this each year, highly interested by the South Korean model of development. They always ask the question why it is possible that a country that was so poor in the 50s is now belong to the first economic power of the world. So I think this is my task to explain that it has been a global work, not only focused on industrialization, but President Park Chung-hee's work was concerned also policy, foreign policy, culture, education, science, and of course rural development and agriculture. And on that matter, I think it's worth to work on the Semaul movement in France and to go on with this work. Also because, and I refer again to what Professor Lee and Professor Kwon, Professor So, but also Editor Che told us this morning about their own experience, their own memories, and also about the future of the Semaul movement. And we really can take lesson from this. 감사합니다.
예, 감사합니다. 다음은 Dr. Raja Pasha.
Thank you very much. Next is Dr. Rajapaksha.
Thank you very much. I'm amazed to see how very three different places, Sri Lanka being a small island in South Asia with a very small population. Then in my right hand side, one of the most powerful countries in the world and a developed country for a long time, France, and China being another probably one of the largest economies in the world with a huge population. But how some of the challenges we have been facing as communities are very close to each other. Even when I first read about the Semaul movement, one thing I realized, the history is repeating. The same thing is happening in our countries, what happened decades ago in South Korea. So the technology has changed a lot. The way we can learn has changed a lot. The way we can share the experiences has changed a lot. I think the new technology has given us a tremendous opportunity to cross-learn, cross-share some of the best practices from Korea to China to France. I think that's the spirit we all can bring together to the table now. And even what Semaul Foundation is doing in Sri Lanka, it has been successful simply because the spirit of the community, the sense of community, which we have practiced over the years with the influence of Buddhism, with the influence of the other Eastern philosophies in our countries, have been very similar. So that is why even when Semaul Foundation came to Sri Lanka, they could successfully implement some of the work, because the social hierarchy, the fabric of the society is very similar. The way people respond to your other community members, the respond to the hierarchy, respond to the sense of community is very similar. So I think we have a great opportunity now with the advancement of the communication technology more than ever to share these experiences and stop repeating some of the mistakes we have done in the history, and especially looking at what is happening all around the world. The entire world is going through a massive economic crisis. So small countries like us are the first to suffer from the energy crisis to the economic crisis to, all these crises, the wars happening all around the world now. We small countries are the first to suffer. So let's work together as not only as the small communities, but as one big global community. Now I think that is what President Park wanted to do decades ago. I think the time has arrived again for us to work as one global community. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 마지막으로 모 교수님.
Last but not least, Dr. Mo, for your response. Thank you very much for the great comments. Well, concerning the questions by Dr. No, I would like to answer them first. And concerning the 새마을운동 and the self-sufficient villages, the last type of rural communities that I mentioned, well, I did mention the similarities in my presentation as well. First of all, it's actually because the people are different. In the 70s, the farmers in the 70s are different from the current day farmers in terms of their awareness and knowledge. And so that is one difference that we can take into account. So the difference in knowledge and awareness. And so that will then translate into differences in the way that they govern or operate their villages. And second, I do believe that the local residents are the people that are the most knowledgeable about their communities. Well, I talked about 5 different types of rural communities, and all of them have been successful. If you visit Chinese local communities, well, a few days ago, I talked to the staff for this forum, and we saw that in Sri Lanka, you also have example of successes, but also those that have not been so successful. But I think everything has been quite successful in China. In China, we say the government does its best, but the villagers are just standing by. So if something is prescribed from the outside, then that may not be appropriate for the local community. And so that may lead to some failures. And the success case of the independent or the self-sufficient rural communities was because the original residents was well aware of what is needed for the local communities, and it was successful without the intervention of the government. And there was another question addressed to me. It was about how the traditional towns could be connected with the 새마을 movement and also concerning the leadership. Well, I did mention this in my presentation. The leaders of the villages, they are not official government organizations. The smallest unit for local government in China are groups of villages. So the leaders in individual villages are not a part of the official government structure. So they manage their own local communities. But I loved your question because if the opportunity does arise, I would like to research concerning the similarities between 새마을 movement and also the local leadership in the rural villages of China. Thank you very much for your answer. We are a little bit behind schedule.
네 분의 발표.
So thank you very much to the 3 presenters as well as the 3 discussants. Once again, let me thank everyone for your participation. And with that, we're going to conclude session 2. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the speakers and the panelists. So that was about the 새마을운동 scene from outsiders' views and also the different models of rural development in other countries. So thank you very much. So now then, yes, session 2, we were able to listen to, once again, meaningful and in-depth content. Thank you very much. And also to the presenters, the discussants, as well as the chair. So thank you very much for your input and contribution, which allowed us to better understand the status and also the rural development programs in other countries. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a 15-minute break, and we will start the next session at 3 o'clock. Thank you.